All right, everybody, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to The Nostalgia Trap. Thanks so much for tuning into the show. I hope you enjoy what we've got for you this week. This week, we're talking with Dr. Drew Morton. Drew is someone I found on Twitter. He is an assistant professor of mass communication at Texas A&amp. He got a PhD in cinema and media studies at UCLA, so I'm super jealous of that because studying film is one of my favorite things in the world. And as many of you know, that's what I studied as an undergrad at UCSB. That's Santa Barbara, many years ago in the 90s. And I had a very particular experience of studying film during that kind of like Tarantino indie film moment. We get into a bit about that, the kind of particular era of film studies both of us entered into. But I wanted to talk to Drew because I wanted to hear like what that whole discipline is like in the 21st century, how it's expanding and moving into different kinds of questions and ideas. So we talk about all sorts of stuff in this conversation, from the Coen brothers to Steven Soderbergh, and we talk about comic book movies and a lot of Drew's particular work in the video essay, which, if you don't know what a video essay is, you know, there's a lot of YouTube videos that do this, but what Drew is doing with the magazine that he created, it's an academic journal. It's called In Transition, the Journal of Videographic Film and Moving Image Studies, which you should check out. He has a lot of great videos from that he's made, that other film scholars have made, in which they're basically, you know, using their academic knowledge to kind of share that academic knowledge within a video that uses clips and excerpts and text on the screen, and it's really an art form unto its own. And I feel like Drew is someone who's really working to bring that art form to a wider audience. So go check out In Transition, the Journal of Videographic Film and Moving Image Studies. I'll place all of this stuff in the description. But I hope you enjoy this conversation. I just wanted to talk about movies. We've been talking about movies a lot lately. Part of that is because I think people are hungering for some content beyond just plague content and pandemic stuff. So I want to talk about film and media, something that I'm actually teaching a course on the history of cinema right now on Zoom. So it's brought me back into that fold. So we'll have a couple more episodes coming up about movies. I hope you enjoy them. And speaking of that, we've got some of our own analysis on our Patreon up. Justin at Rogers Cooper and I are continuing our Deadwood conversation, so watch out on the Patreon. And we've got some vibe checks up lately where we're talking to Peter Sabatino and Bill Black and KJ Shepard and some other favorites about kind of checking in on what the world is like right now. I know you need to hear that stuff too. So if you want to get in on that conversation, we've been having a lot of fun threads on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Really appreciate the people who support the show. It's more critical to me now than ever before as we enter into a period of extreme uncertainty for contingent academics like myself. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Enjoy all our Nostalgia Trap stuff. Here is me talking with Dr. Drew Morton. Okay, well, Dr. Drew Morton, I'm so excited to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I've been following your Twitter for a while, but I think it was last week that you posted a screenshot from the Coen brothers film, A Serious Man from 2009. And it was a screenshot that was not your typical, like, Serious Man screenshot. And I was like, where do I know that from? Where do I know this guy from? And it was a cool thread because it made me remember that film. And I actually have a tattoo of that movie, the tornado from that movie, because the ending to that film, just that image was so profound to me. But anyway, we can talk about Coen brothers, we can talk about film, we can talk about a lot of things with you, but thanks for joining us, Drew.
Sure. Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
When I think about the Coen brothers, they're really tricky filmmakers to me. And I want to get into your education as a film scholar and how you kind of, I don't know, how you split the difference between being a film fan and a film scholar, and like thinking about film in an academic way, but also being a huge fan. Because I don't know, I'm teaching film for the first time in a few years right now, and it's making me kind of go back from being just a fan to back into that kind of like, how do you communicate this to people? How do you get people to understand? And with the Coen brothers, it's like, I don't know, they're such tricky filmmakers to me because it almost feels like, where do you start when you try to explain the Coen brothers to like an undergrad? Do you ever teach Coen brothers films?
I teach A Serious Man when I do a unit on American independent cinema in a film production class. audience.
Mm.
So I pick it because I like to use Serious Man as an example of how it breaks away from classical Hollywood storytelling, which is about cause and effect, right? And so what I like about Serious Man is it constantly sets up cause and effect patterns, but then undermines them. So like the car crash scene is a perfect example for me, where, you see the two of them and there's that parallel editing and you think, he's going to hit Cy Abelman's car in the way that it's constructed. And then you realize it's two very different car accidents. And Michael Stroberg's character goes to like the rabbi and starts to kind of talk about it and is like, he had an accident at the same time that I did. And what does that mean? And then, of course, he never gets an answer for it. Or in a scene like the Goy's Teeth, where, I show that scene to my students, even so essentially they're in little groups and some of them have to watch Serious Man. But when they come back to discuss their American indie film with everyone else, I always show the Goy's Teeth scene because essentially it's that movie in a nutshell, which is like there's this really weird occurrence. No one, there's all these attempts to make sense of it. But at the end of the day, there's nothing to be taken away and you just have to kind of walk away from it or you're going to drive yourself crazy. And so I like how the film constantly sets up moments where it's like, oh, is it the mentaculus that will make sense of this? Is it God that'll make sense of this? Is it, one of his formulas on the board or his thought experiments that will give sense of, some sort of sense to what is going on in this guy, anything, and it's just random chaos of the universe. So that's particularly why I like Serious Man and how I try to teach them. I haven't really brought any other of their films into my classroom. I think I've maybe shown pieces of Hail Caesar when I talk about...
Yeah, I don't think... in fact, I think Hail Caesar may be the only Coen Brothers film I haven't seen, just because I just never got around to it. And it's a film that it seems like it would it might fill something in for me, because you're talking about, I like how, I'd never really thought about A Serious Man as a kind of a repudiation of classical Hollywood cinema and its need to like always have like this chain, this like causal chain, and that they're literally saying like there is no causal chain. There might be like just random events happening. And to connect that to cinema is really like, because I mean, isn't Hail Caesar taking place in like the kind of the apex of like classical Hollywood cinema?
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that's the blessing and the curse of recent Coens. I think there's this story that once, I think that when their mom dies, essentially they go down, right around the time of, I think, Lady Killers. They start to go down this like existentially empty like theme route where essentially every movie has the same message of a serious man, right? Every movie they make during like the last 15 years has that message where, we can't make sense out of it. We're fucked, right?
Yeah.
No Country for Old Men has it, right? Where, he's sitting at the table with his wife and they're trying to talk about his dream and he's trying to get some sort of, meaning out of the experience he's just had. And again, that film kind of undermines cause and effect in fairly unique ways where you don't see how the Brolin character dies and it's all done in an aftermath and you don't really fully make sense out of it. And then, Tommy Lee Jones is like, I don't know what any of this is about, right?
Yeah.
And then Burn After Reading, all of them kind of have that moment at the end where some character is like, what does it all mean? And it's like, well, we can't know.
Yeah, I know that the ending of Burn After Reading is so ridiculous. It's like literally just like the guy just like throwing his hands up and saying, well, we'll never figure this out, and the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's weird, and I think the tendency could be to be like, well, they're just kind of fucking with us. They're making films that don't matter, but it seems like there's an identifiable strand there of despair. Yeah, it's funny when the Brolin character in No Country for Old Men, the first time I saw that movie, I didn't even catch that he had died. I was like, was that him? I mean, they don't even like...
Yeah.
And you're following this guy the whole film. I mean, the whole film is kind of like really meticulously showing every moment of this guy's being chased by these people, and then when the climax comes, it's just kind of like meaningless. Yeah, wow. Their films have evolved over time, and it feels like, you get back to like kind of thinking about, I don't know, the way you explain that to undergrads. Part of me is like, the more knowledge you have, the more you get from a Coen Brothers film, which is like a weird kind of elitism to their stuff. I don't know. I never know where to kind of put them, because they're almost like cult filmmakers at the same time they're really popular and well-known filmmakers.
I think there's some truth to that. I also think in certain ways, they're kind of as close to like a Stanley Kubrick as you get now, where like I've seen Coen Brothers movies the first time out and been like, yeah, that wasn't for me, or that was my reading of it. Like I can think of Big Lebowski's a big one, and then Inside Llewellyn Davis,
Yeah.
which I saw both when they came out, and I didn't like them. And then of course you watch Big Lebowski and you get beyond the plot the first time, and you're like, well, when you're just paying attention to the dialogue and the exchanges between these characters, it's really funny. But Llewellyn Davis, my issue with that one when it came out was I was like, it's just doing the same theme of Serious Man and these other ones where it's, this guy, no matter how hard he tries, Sisyphus going up the mountain with the rock, he's doomed to fail. But he's also such, in certain ways, I think a much richer character than some of the other Coen Brothers protagonists, because so often they want to do caricature, which kind of takes away from empathy.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
they kind of become these, these kind of caricatures, these kind of hollow representations. Whereas Llewellyn, is, I feel like, much more well-rounded than some of their other characters or protagonists.
That's why that one was so critically acclaimed, I feel like, was in part because you could connect to the character and in their most... And I don't know if this is actually a weakness of theirs or not, because I think they do it so well. I kind of wonder, like, how they're able to get such a, like, kind of consistent tone from their actors. Like, their actors are always, like, Coen-y actors. And you're right, they
Sure.
can fall into, like, sometimes it feels like, well, these are just props in their kind of, in the kind of, like, meta jokes they're making. They're not real, almost like, I don't know, the way... certain characters in Lebowski come off as, like, Julianne Moore's character comes off as just, okay, she's supposed to be like the 70s feminist artist, like she's a stand-in for certain points they want to make about California and things like that.
Sure.
But at the same time, I enjoy that so much. I think that's what's hard about their films, is because I want to, like, in other words, I want to explain why that's so cool to people, but it takes like some kind of historical knowledge and some kind of cultural knowledge to even unpack what their films are trying to say.
Sure. And I just think in general, because it's comedy, and I feel like, and I know this gets thrown around a lot, but comedy is so subjective in terms of what people find funny. So yeah, like I've shown Lebowski to some friends, and it's just like, they're just like, I do not understand why this movie is funny in the first place. And sure, I think some of it comes from, the more you know about film noir and the more you know about protagonists and noir, like the PI detective, I think you get more richer enjoyment. But at the end of the day, if you're not down with like the kind of dark, shaggy comedy of their movies, it's not going to click anyways.
Yeah, I get
no matter
that.
how much genre knowledge you have. So yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of it is just you're on board with that tone or you're not.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I do think there are variances to it, though. I really do. Like I think a film like Llewellyn Davis or even Serious Man at certain points kind of takes it almost seems more mature than something that's kind of, I don't know, more madcap in the earlier stuff. Like watching something like Raising Arizona, which is not my favorite film of theirs, I get kind of exhausted by it because it's kind of the one, the two notes on repeat, and it feels like I'm watching a live action Looney Tunes cartoon, which I'm like, there's a reason Looney Tunes cartoons are 10 minutes, because after about 3 or 4 of them, you're like, I need to take a break for a minute and get some air. But yeah, I don't know.
It makes me remember Roger Ebert's review, and I don't know if this is true for you. I mean, it might be like a certain age of person, but I read a lot of Roger Ebert reviews because he was like one of the first people online to have like a comprehensive collection of his reviews that you could go back and like read all his stuff. And so I wanted to know like and you could search by stars, I remember. So you could I wanted to know which like ones he had given 4 stars to. And I remember, like being in high school and Fargo came out, and everyone was talking about how cool Fargo was, and I watched it with my mom, and like we'd rented it, and I really loved it, and I felt like I got like a lot of the like jokes that they were making and things like that. But my mom was kind of bored by it and like just felt that it was like just a straightforward murder story. She didn't get what was so special about it, and I think I didn't either, really. I mean, I needed to read, but it makes me think like I started reading those Roger Ebert reviews, and like he gave 4 stars to Blood Simple, said it was like the most amazing debut, and then he hated Raising Arizona, and he said exactly what you're saying about it. He was like, "Oh, it's such a disappointment that such like filmmakers that had such a great promising debut made this like Looney Tunes cartoon film." So it's funny because I feel like that. I don't know, Raising Arizona. You're right. I love the opening of it. It's like that diaper chase robbery scene is just an incredible kind of. You can show that in so many film classes for so many different things. But yeah, I don't know if it hangs together still. I haven't watched it in a long time. I wonder if you can respond to that, but I was wondering if we could talk about your history too, if you remember the first Coen Brothers films you watched or reviews you read.
The first one I think I saw was Fargo. I started a podcast for a little while, and I did it for like a year. So I would always kind of have this moment with my guest where I'd talk about I call it my Martin Scorsese summer.
Yeah.
I had a summer where my appendix broke and I was misdiagnosed, and it was like between 8th grade and freshman year of high school. And so for like 2 weeks I was going around and almost died. And it was at the same time that AFI list came out, that first top 100 list. And I was starting to get into movies, and the appendix breaks. I'm sick for a while. And then they finally bring me into the hospital, and they're like, "Holy shit, this guy's almost dead," and we thought he had the flu.
Wow.
It was crazy, but I was in the hospital for like a month, and so I'd keep sending my parents to the AFI list that I saw on TV like 2 weeks into my illness, and I want to go through the list and watch these movies. So I'd send them with like a list of 4 or 5 on the AFI list, and Fargo was one of them. And I remember seeing it, and I'm from the Midwest, so I thought it was really funny and, violent. And I had seen Quentin Tarantino stuff before, so that was kind of my first frame of reference for them. And yeah, I really dug it. And then I went back because my grandpa was actually a really fairly informed like moviegoer, and he told me about Blood Simple. He's like, "Yeah, these guys did this movie back in the 80s that's about like Texas, and it's pretty good." And I remember watching Blood Simple, and I don't think I got it as well, but I also didn't know noir quite as well as I know it now. And I was like, wow, this is kind of a sleepy movie, and yeah, there's some interesting parts, but yeah, it doesn't have the same kind of consistency as Fargo. And then I go back to Blood Simple now, and it's just like that's a great movie. And again, it's got some of those kind of funny twists of fate that you see in all the other Coen Brothers movies, where if you watch Blood Simple and you think about it, all of their problems are caused by the fact that they can't talk to one another. The main, I can't remember their names, but John Getz's character can't talk to Frances McDormand and be honest, right? They constantly have to hide information from each other. Whereas if they were being honest with each other, the hitman wouldn't get nearly as far along in his plotting as they would allow. I don't know. But in terms of like reading about them, I think I had read, some Ebert stuff. I hadn't read the Raising Arizona piece. That's funny. But yeah, I mean, Ebert was very much kind of my shepherd in, along with things like the AFI list. And I liked Premiere Magazine a lot. And I was like, Entertainment Weekly was okay, but it was always like you got like a paragraph, and I'm like, I want more, So
you remember,
I felt like maybe more meat on the bone.
This is totally the world that I was in the 90s, and that's part of I think why I connect with so much of what you talk about with film. I wonder if it's kind of like a product of that particular film burst that happened in the 90s. I mean, I was right there with Tarantino, and I was like, young, but still like intrigued by this stuff, and thought. It was supposed to be hip and cool, and violence was really cool in the 90s. And yeah, do you remember Libby Gelman Waxner in Premiere Magazine? I don't know if you remember that column. There was a column by this person named Libby Gelman Waxner. I think it was like a gossip column, but ended up being like a lot about movies and stuff like that. And yeah, you're right. Premiere drew me in a way that Entertainment was much more surfacey. Premiere's not around though anymore, right? I think it's gone.
I don't think Premiere Magazine, I think, went under maybe 4 or 5 years ago, which was, a loss. And I don't even know to what degree Entertainment Weekly's still around.
Barely. Yeah.
But so many of those film mags are kind of just defunct now. I think Film Comment is gone under. And yeah, somebody had posted something, and I'm in this Facebook group on the Criterion Collection, which can be kind of insufferable. But today someone was like, what are film magazines we can read? And it's like, well, you got Cineast, you got Film Comment, you got Film Quarterly, and you used to have Kaedu Cinema, but that's, you know, that's basically all we got now.
Yeah, there used to be Film Threat, and of course, Ain't It Cool News. I don't know if you remember Ain't It Cool News.
Oh, yeah, unfortunately, I do.
I think that guy is still around somewhere. But yeah, it was a very specific kind of 90s culture that like produced that. And I could say that was definitely why I switched my major to film studies when I was at UCSB, because I didn't realize that you could major in that, really. Sure. I mean, I don't think I even understood that was a discipline. I was a very naive college kid that, like, you know, majored in political science because I thought that, well, maybe I'll go to law school or something. I really had no idea. But I saw an audition. So this is at UC Santa Barbara. I know you went to UCLA, so we can bond on the UC system. But UC in the 90s, but UCSB, like, they had I don't know, I saw like a flyer for like an audition for a student film, and I was like, maybe I can go try to be an actor or something. There was something exciting about it. I don't know. I was 20 years old, and I went over to the film department, and I saw all these film posters, and I saw like this whole world, and I was like, can you actually major in this? You could actually do this? I wonder what was the moment for you that you realized you could like major in film? Do you remember a particular moment, or what was it that drew you to kind of, in other words, what drew you from being like a film fan and being like casually interested to someone who thought like, oh, I could like study this for college?
It's a difficult question. So this came out of the Scorsese summer thing. One of the movies I really wanted to see that summer was Steven Soderbergh's Out of Sight.
Yeah.
And I kept seeing the trailers for it. Like, one of the last movies I saw before I went into the hospital was Truman Show. And they had these trailers for Out of Sight, and I'm like, that looks kind of sexy, and it's got George Clooney, and it's got good music. It's got the 70s funk thing going on. I was like, I want to see that movie. And so the first thing I did when I got out of the hospital is I went to see Out of Sight. I'm like, that's a really good movie. Like, I mean, I felt like at this time, I'd still stand by that assessment that it's a great movie. But it prompted me to go back and watch all of his stuff. And it was really the first kind of deep dive I did on an auteur. So, you know, I started watching all of Soderbergh's films. I started reading interviews, because his interviews and his commentary tracks, I think he's kind of one of the smartest people, maybe up there with like David Fincher or like a Jean-Luc Godard or Eisenstein when it comes to like dissecting the craft of film. He's really, really thoughtful.
I agree.
And smart. And so like I'd make lists and I'd be like, okay, he's talking about Mike Nichols. I have to go watch Petunia, and I have to go watch this, and I have to check out this guy's movies. And I started kind of doing that. It became like this almost free association, kind of united by what was going on in Steven Soderbergh's brain. And so that had interested me. And then I thought I was going to be like an English teacher or a film critic. And at my undergrad institution, UW-Milwaukee, you had to kind of wait 2 years before you could pick a major. So you could kind of plan what you wanted, but the idea was you were going to take your core classes and maybe dabble in a bunch of majors that you might be interested in. So I was doing English, I was doing film production, and I was doing film studies. And then I found out basically the English degree and the film studies degree were like, you could double major very easily and get 2 BAs with like the addition of a Shakespeare class and like a woman's poetry class. So I just kind of did that. But my wife will joke that, you know, we started dating my freshman or sophomore year of college when I found out there was a film studies professor on campus, and that was a thing. I was like, I'm going to be one of those guys. You know, that's what I want to do. And she was like, she, I think, thought I was nuts at the time. And she's like, no, you ended up going out and doing it. But yeah, I mean, I thought I was going to be a critic. I thought I was going to write at a newspaper, but it was also, I did it for a while and it just wasn't rewarding because so much of it's short. And so I'd constantly write pieces for my high school newspaper or my college newspaper, and I get notes back from my editor where they're like, you're too long, or this is too detailed, right? You're writing a review. And I'm just like, the idea of a movie review just boxes you in so many different ways of expressing your opinions that, like, I'm like, I don't want to write.
Yeah. That actually, if you choose to be a film critic, you're kind of bound by like writing about particular film. Yeah, that makes sense. So in other words, books by film critics are always just collections of reviews.
Yeah, because I mean, you have to give like a plot summary. You have to say what's good and bad, and it's like maybe you touch on theme a little bit, but like especially now with people so angsty about spoilers, it's not like you can have like a deep reading of a movie in a movie review. I mean, you go back and read Pauline Kael's stuff, and it's like you can do that now. People wouldn't do that, that kind of analysis. It would just be like you're spoiling the movie, or I'm not going to engage with that, or I think that kind of criticism has kind of gone away.
Rotten Tomatoes ruined fucking everything, man.
Well, and it's us too. I mean, like. I don't. Did you see those tweets by Noah Berlasky today?
You know what? You know what's funny? I'm proud to say I'm blocked by Noah Berlasky, so I
am now too.
But it doesn't take much.
But he's doing that for a reason, which is like people want to read something where it's very hyperbolic and like, here's my flag, I'm gonna plant it. There's no nuance in this conversation. Like that's just kind of what the discourse has become. Yes, part of that's Rotten Tomatoes' fault, but part of that's our fault because like that's all we really want to read anymore, or how we want to discuss things. Like
a hot take.
Yeah, it's just like you have to have a hyperbolic. Like I get into this with my friends who like Star Wars or Marvel movies. It's like there's only one reading to this, and let people enjoy things. And it's like, well, I don't hate Marvel, I don't love Marvel. Can I be in the middle like here and be like, yeah, there's some stuff it's
fuck
like,
you, choose a side.
Read that take, no one wants to read the lukewarm take.
Yeah, for those that don't know, that Noah Berlasky, and I think I saw some of this from screenshots, is that wasn't he basically saying that like all of Spielberg's filmography is trash, and that it's just like Spielberg as a filmmaker is worthless essentially? Which is kind of like, okay, it's like, if you think that, fine, I could actually maybe get on the side with you, maybe, but it's kind of like a boring kind of way of doing things.
Was that where he went over the line for me? Is he said Spielberg doesn't know anything about craft, and I'm like, you can criticize a lot of things about Spielberg. The one thing you really can't criticize him for is craft. Like that, when it comes to knowing how to put blocking with shots and music together, there's not really a better director of that right now. I mean, he's to a point where it's like, it's almost kind of boring watching his movies, because it's like, okay, like I know how you almost know how he's going to block things, because there is such a distinctive signature there, and he's so just economical and always going for that same kind of emotional register, which is why I resent Spielberg on one level. I'm like, don't tell me how to feel, just let me feel it.
Totally. Yep.
But he knows how to oil the machine. So I'm like, to say that he doesn't know anything about craft, I'm just like, you lost me. Like, we can talk about the politics of his movies, we can talk about how he's gotten a little lazy, but like, yeah, like to say he's Tom Clancy and doesn't understand craft, I don't understand the argument.
Well, speaking of craft, I mean, you mentioned Out of Sight. I mean, you and I have a parallel track in a lot of ways, because Out of Sight blew my mind when that came out in 1998. And I remember people talking about it as this kind of like Pulp Fiction-y, like a riff on Pulp Fiction almost. But I felt it was so much different than Pulp Fiction. And I also, began to look at Soderbergh and thought that he seems like a guy that knows a lot, and a guy that knows how to shoot within whatever context he's in. Like, you could give him anything and he'll be like, oh, here's the right way to shoot this. It's kind of stunning, like how what a filmmaker he is, and what like varied filmmaker he is. Like, he can do, like, he's done like big Hollywood stuff, he's done arty stuff, he's done like kind of like documentary stuff. He's like, is he still working? I thought he like retired and he's painting now.
He was, and then he came back so he was retired and he was painting. So I think he stopped with Side Effects, and then he did The Nick for TV, and did Mosaic and a couple other TV shows. And then he'd work as like a DP. So he shot Magic Mike Extra Extra Large, and then he started coming back. So what was his I think Unsane was his first movie back. Unsane and Logan Lucky were like his first two back. And then he's had High Flying Bird.
I haven't seen any of this stuff. Is it good?
I mean, what I always say, like the same thing about Soderbergh. It's like when it's not good, it's least interesting. So like, so I mean, Logan Lucky is fine. Like it's trying to be. People called it like Ocean 7-Eleven, which is kind of true. Where
That's
it's
right. Yep.
it's got some fun. It's got some fun performances. It's not. I don't think a great film. I think out of the bunch of them, I like Unsane probably the most. So that's a little thriller he shot on an iPhone with Claire Foy, where she's being stalked and you're not sure if she's actually crazy or not. And it's really one of those unsettling movies where you don't know if the person's nuts or not. Where like I feel like so many other films like I went through this kind of series earlier in the quarantine where I was watching movies like Gaslight, where I'm like, you tip the hand too early, whether or not you know the person is crazy or if they're being tricked, right? I can't remember what the other one I watched was, but there were a couple of them where essentially you were left to question the person's sanity, but it was very clear early on that they were being manipulated. And Unsane, I feel like, does a really good job of just kind of walking that until the end. And it's extremely just, it's nerve-wracking, and it's really well done. High Flying Bird is good. Again, that's another iPhone movie, so you got to kind of be down with that aesthetic. So everything's super wide angle, and the lighting's not always great. My issue with it, it's a sports movie. It's kind of like the version of Moneyball he always wanted to make, where it's very, very into sports. And I'm like, I'm not a sports guy, so like when you're talking about NBA Players Union, like legality clauses and stuff, I'm just like. I mean, I can appreciate it on a performance level and staging, but yeah, it's just like that's not a world I know that much about, so I felt a little on the outs. And then The Laundromat was his newer film, which is kind of like a Adam McKay type riff on the money laundering that was going on with that. It was those two guys who got caught with the Panama Papers. It's not good. It's kind of like The Informant, where he's trying to do some kind of mad screwball, comedy on top of I
feel like filmmakers can, I don't know, there are very few of them can carry on, like it can like keep it going. Like they have like bursts of like when they were young made this, Tarantino has evolved, but I think he had to kind of like force himself to evolve after he saw There Will Be Blood. I think that's the story, is that Tarantino saw There Will Be Blood and he had just put out Death Proof, and was oh fuck, like I need to up my game. I'm making like these little nostalgia pieces, and PTA's outdoing me into history and shit like that. But I don't know. I wonder, to get back to your story in terms of you say you're like from Milwaukee or the Midwest. At what point do you pack up and head to LA, and what's that like to head to, because you get a PhD at UCLA, right?
Yeah, so I applied to a bunch of schools when I was getting my bachelor's because I knew I wanted to keep going. And about half the faculty at UW-Milwaukee went to a UC school. So my mentor was Patrice Petro, who got her PhD from UC Santa Barbara and is actually teaching there now. But she was like, you should apply to Santa Barbara. And then some of the other faculty members were like, you should apply to UCLA, keep your options open. A couple people said USC, but I knew USC was going to be expensive. And then Milwaukee. So my first choice was actually going to be Santa Barbara, because that was where I felt like I had the real leg up, knowing Patrice. And Patrice at the time, I think, was the president of the Society of Cinema and Media Studies. So I was like, this is going to go through, right? And I didn't get in there. I got into Milwaukee and I got into UCLA, and it was like, well, do I want to stay here or do I want to go to Hollywood? And it's like, well, if that's the choice, I'm going to roll the dice. And so my wife and I packed up and we moved that summer. And I think I mentioned to you in a note that I spent the first couple months of my California life up by you in Ventura with family. But yeah, so that's what got us out here. And then, I started my master's degree. And, I fell in with this great group of people, that's the really great thing about graduate school, is you get this really small cohort of people from all over the place. And, in most cases, at least I don't know people I talk to, but you all get along really well. And it's a small group of, you're like family at a certain point, where you're looking out for each other and, making sure everyone's got their books and they're staying on point. You're having great discussions at the bar. So I fell in with this great group of friends, and my wife got a really good job at the Directors Guild at the time. And, then it came time very quickly within, essentially you applied the December before the next year, right? So within a year, I basically had to apply again for PhD schools. And it was like Santa Barbara again, USC, UCLA, I think maybe Austin. And I was in at UCLA, and they'd given me 3 years of funding, and Santa Barbara was like, we want to get you in, but we can't promise you. It was something about the deal where it wasn't as much funding as UCLA.
Mm-hmm.
And I have this theory that, like, the professors in the UC system all kind of know each other, where it's like, they're not going to let you outbid one another, where it's like, we're going to give him this. And it's like, okay, all right, he's going to go with you. We're not going to try to beat that. We'll get this other guy from another school, so they want to help you, but they also don't want to like cut their noses off to spite their face when it comes to getting you some financing. So I stayed at UCLA because I knew the people there. And at that point it was like, I like Santa Barbara, but I'm like, that place is far away, and it's like 3 hours away from everything I like. So
yeah,
I was kind of like, unless they're going to give me a lot more money to go up there, I think I'll stay down here and stick with the devil I know.
It's weird.
But
UCSB.
Yeah, that was really it.
Yeah, I only majored as an undergrad in film studies, and when I went and did my PhD, it was in New York City years later, and in American history. So film became a kind of like sideshow to the larger kind of historical questions I was pursuing. But either way, Santa Barbara was an up and coming film department in the 90s, and more. It seems like more on the kind of like theory than production. Although production has started to get bigger in Santa Barbara. But it's funny you say that, because I remember being at Santa Barbara and being like, man, if you're majoring in film, you should be in LA. Like LA is like where it's at. Like the LA schools, and UCLA and USC have their own kind of thing going on down there. But I wonder. What it is that at what point do you realize what you're studying as a film scholar? In other words, how did you find your focus? I know I'm looking at your book right now, which is called Panel to the Screen: Style, American Film, and Comic Books During the Blockbuster Era. Is that your dissertation? Was that developed out of your dissertation?
It was my dissertation. That's a good question. Before we get there, I just want to double back on something you said about the film programs. In certain ways, I envy UC Santa Barbara for being more divorced from production than UCLA or UW-Milwaukee. I mean, I like the fact that I had to take production classes at both those schools, and I think it gave me certain skill sets that make me more valuable on the job market now, because I can teach production to a certain extent, and it got me into the videographic work and all that. But at the same time, like at UCLA, like, we were always the bottom of the tier within that production school. So when it came to resources, when it came to money, when it came to hiring, when it came to the dean, given, what money she had to anybody, we never got any. And it was just like, we were like the bastard stepchild. And like and half your students would be these film production kids who'd take these film history classes who were like, I don't give a shit about, 20s German movies. Why am I in this class? And it was just like, see, you were teaching the same thing, but because you weren't aligned with the humanities department, that idea of the way in which we kind of approach things and the kind of liberal arts inquiry mode was just kind of strange. You were just like out of place with these people.
I'm so glad you brought that split up, because it was at UCSB too, where it's kind of like the production people versus the theory people, and and kind of it's weird because like part of it is that the theory people, there's always this assumption that like, oh, well, deep down they really want to make films. Like they're just saying they don't want to do production. Like everybody wants to do production, but you've just chosen this theory thing. But yeah, that always seemed like a split, and it felt like, God, what a tragedy it is that there's people that there's like people that understand the larger issues at stake in film, and then the people that are making film, and never the twain shall meet.
Well, like, I mean, and then there were some people at UCLA who tried to get you to do both. And I think I think there is a really fruitful intersection between both. The issue becomes, as so many of these programs are like, the one way of making, this is where I think Milwaukee does it well, is the emphasis there is more on independent filmmaking and like artsy, like Stan Brakhage, Maya Deren experimental filmmaking, where it's more about personal expression and alternatives to Hollywood. But at UCLA, I'm taking these production classes in the producers program and screenwriting and stuff, and they're just all very cynical. And it's like, well, you gotta like make the most money you can and try to game this in such a way that you got a calling card that makes you economically viable and getting a step in the door. And I'm like, I get that, but like that to me is just the most pessimistic and cynical, craven way of making a movie that I cannot compute with. So yeah, there were a couple folks who tried to like meet the two, and I think those were the more kind of fruitful classes. Like John Caldwell, one of my dissertation advisors, does film practice as well. And so he did this really great class I remember on documentary where like the theorists, the cinema studies kids in the rooms were writing like a 20-page like research paper about something related to documentary. But if you were a production student and you didn't feel like that was going to interest you or better your education, you could write a prospectus for a documentary film that you would make. So essentially it was like a prospectus that you could like apply for an NEH grant to go out and make a documentary. And I was like, that like desire to kind of like give both sides of the house an assignment that would further them down the road really spoke to me. And I thought that was a really great idea. And he really wanted those students at the table to kind of talk about, lenses and, sound equipment. And then, the theory kids would start to interrogate them about ethics. And those were really good conversations, but it's not every teacher who can kind of facilitate that or wants to facilitate that.
Yeah, and I think that maybe that's one of the curses of studying film in LA. You're so close to the industry, and it's kind of like I like that idea that you just shared of like kind of showing that there are different paths. That it's not just necessarily you creating that brand and becoming that cynical filmmaker. But when you hear that kind of stuff, and like to me, realizing that like a lot of the kids that were production kids were like rich kids that like were already kind of connected, and like knowing that there was this kind of like ugly part of the industry, feeling like Barton Fink a little bit, like like being like, what is all this? And like, I'm an artist, I'm a writer, but it makes me wonder like how like the filmmakers that do become successful in Hollywood that are I consider really brilliant artists, how they made it and how they negotiated all that stuff. And that's why I love reading memoirs and biographies about those kinds of filmmakers, because you realize you almost have to play the game, but they like don't lose their soul in it. I don't know, it's really tricky.
Well, I mean, that to me brings us back to someone like Soderbergh, where it's like he's got that model down where it's like, I'm gonna make Ocean's movies, I'll crank those out. I'll do a couple other big budget, films that basically, make a profit, but then I'm going to use that leverage from making those movies to, make a direct to video, bubble. Like it's like half of, you could put it on a credit card and, shoot it over a weekend. So I don't know. I think there is something to be said for that. I don't think that track necessarily exists anymore, but
yeah.
I don't know. Like every time I'm pessimistic about things, and I get into this with some friends of mine sometimes, like I'm like, I think Netflix is actually far more progressive and radical than people want to give them credit for. Like people, like a lot of film Twitter are like, Netflix is killing the movies. And I'm like, they gave David Lynch money for the short that they're going to put on there. They let P.T. Anderson do this weird music video at Palm York. And I'm like, the Irishman, like, I'm like, they're taking some chances here. So every time I feel like movies are, kind of in a precarious position, I just think they've moved and gone somewhere else for a little while.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, Netflix just feels like kind of a lateral evolution in some way, a different kind of engaging with Hollywood. But it definitely feels like, I don't know, people talk about, and comic books being the kind of like Marvel being the kind of like dominating everything in Hollywood. And I think there is a thirst for other things, and Netflix is at least, if their model is kind of like an algorithm that like kind of gives you what you want to see, it might respond to that. I don't know. I don't know where we're going with any of this. But we're even in a moment with the quarantine where it's like the cinema experience itself of like going to the movies, which was already a kind of like on the ropes in terms of the kind of dominant cultural experience that people have. Now it's even more so, right? And it makes me wonder, what that will look like in the future in terms of the movie industry. It's a different engagement. We're on our phones now.
Yeah, no, I am concerned about it. Although I think it'll, they're saying, last I had heard, AMC thinks they'll be open in late July, and they think production Generally across the town will start up in, mid to late summer, and that'll just be very, very small crews, small sets, and, you have medical practitioners on set. But yeah, like, I don't know, like, are you going to have a 300-seat theater showing Tenet, or are you going to have a 300-seat theater with 30 people in it showing Tenet, and you're just going to put Tenet on all the screens in your multiplex, and that's how it's going to work? I have no idea.
It's really weird. It's a weird moment. It was a weird moment in cinema before this happened, and now you've got kind of that trend accelerated. But thinking about your dissertation and your kind of work on comic books, because I'm not a super big Marvel fan, but at the same time, I get that kind of conversation breaks down into really simplistic terms, and in fact, I think I had a conversation. I don't think you can even call it a conversation when it's on Twitter.
I don't think so either.
More like a series of digital interactions, whatever. But yeah, like whenever the Martin Scorsese Marvel like conversation, whatever that was, seems like a long time ago now. It was like a pre-quarantine conversation where Scorsese had said that Marvel movies were more like theme parks than films, and then that created this huge kind of kerfluffle among Marvel fans who were pushing back and saying that, there are different standards that you can talk about when you're talking about what makes good films and stuff like that. But that's why part of the reason I wanted to talk to you, Drew, is because, you're someone who's studying and writing about comic book movies. What's your own relationship to comic book movies? Because they've changed so much, even in our lifetime.
Sure. Well, it's funny because like the Tim Burton Batman movie, was one of the first movies I really liked as a kid. Yep. So like they've always kind of been there. But what drew me to the dissertation was I started researching it in 2007-ish. Mm-hmm. It came out of one of the classes I took as a senior undergrad. And I was like looking at it, and most of the scholarship we were reading in this class was about fidelity to story, and like, well, what does it mean to be faithful to a story, or what is a story? How can one be faithful? Like, are you faithful to theme? Are you faithful to plot? But everyone was talking about fidelity and adaptation in terms of actual story material, in terms of narrative. And I said, well, where's the conversation about style here? How can you see a little of it in terms of like discussing narration in film and literature, but you don't see a lot of it, or at least I didn't see it at the time. It's kind of one of those classic undergrad moments where it's like, I know what I have access to, and, I don't know how to do research or read beyond that. But I was interested in like visual style. And so I really wanted to write something on Sin City, but the movie was coming out in April and my final paper was due like the week after it came out. And it was like, I can't write a 20-page paper on a movie that I'll have the opportunity to see once in class. So I wrote something on, I think, Akira Kurosawa and Ron or something. And it wasn't bad, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. But the idea kind of stuck with me. And then more and more movies started coming out that made a deliberate aesthetic choice to look like a comic book. Things like Hulk, things like 300. And once there was like a critical mass of those movies, I really wanted to kind of analyze them. And so one of the first videographic works I did was this kind of visual comparison between comics and film. And it grew out of this, I basically co-opted the research for 2 classes as a master's student, where I was writing the paper for one class and then adapting the paper into a video essay in another class simultaneously. Because I thought, the hard thing about writing formalist criticism is it's not fun to read. It just isn't. There are very few people who can write it in a way that's engaging. I mean, David Bordwell has a gift for it, and that's probably about it. And then it's why do
you think that is? Because I mean, I don't want to interrupt, but it's kind of like what you do in these kind of videographic essays. And you have a bunch of them up on your Vimeo that we can put up as a link that are really cool. They're like they're film criticism, and they're done with it while you're watching visual material, whether it be excerpts from the film or text that you're isolating. And I love those video essays. I could watch a million of those, and it feels like your Kubrick one is great. You're thinking about Kubrick and comparing The Shining to the Stephen King book, which sounds like it touches on a lot of the issues you're talking about here, which is like what is adaptation and things like that. But yeah, is it because film writing is like, I remember reading so much film stuff and feeling like it's hard to read in part because I'm not watching the film and I haven't watched like whatever they're referencing. And if a film writer is referencing like lots of different specific shots and plot turns in movies that I haven't seen, is that part of why it's just like tremendously boring to read this material?
I think there's that, and it's like a part of it's just part of the printing process. Like I remember when I was doing my book, I was like, how many pictures can I have?
Yeah.
Like, because that's an issue, or having pictures that are in color, or having pictures. So like around the same time I was writing my book, Scott Buchatman wrote a book on Little Nemo and Slumberland. It's called The Poetic Slumberland. It's a book about Winsor McCay. And this was at UC California Press. And I think he needed like an external grant to get like, these are public domain images, so he didn't have to worry about copyright. But to get color images in his book, like he needed external funding for this. Like the press could not afford it. And then printing prices kind of went down in terms of images by the time my book came around. And so they were like, well, you can have images, but you got to have, I think it was under 50, and they got to be black and white, and you don't get color. And, so like you're already having to make a lot of decisions about what you're going to write about and how you're going to visually analyze it without even considering copyright. If the book was to come out in somewhere like the UK guidelines on copyright and fair use are actually much more towards the side of the copyright holder. So I remember I'd put like one page of the Hulk in an article, and they were like, you can't have one page of the book. That's 1/32 of it, and that will diminish its commercial value or something.
Wow.
I'm like, well, I need to do it. Like no one, I can describe what's on the page, but we're dealing with a visual art form here. It's not like it translates that well, right? This goes back to what Raymond Balleur says about film, where he's like, it's an unattainable text. You can cite literature. You can cite a painting by reproducing it. You can't cite a shot. I mean, I can describe a 30-second shot, but even by the time I start to do that, I lose something in my prose. I can't capture every nuance, every color, every degree that the camera might turn, every piece of mise-en-scène. So you really have to have a visual representation of what it is, I think, to do formal analysis in an engaging way. I mean, like I said, there are exceptions to the rule. I think David Bordwell has found kind of a way to be poetic about describing things, but most of us don't have that gift because most academics are taught how to write really well. We're expected to do it, It's
amazing that it's be black and white pictures for like a book about comic books and film, and like color being such like an extraordinary element within the larger kind of visual iconography of both of those mediums. It seems weird to be like, okay, well, we got to have them in black and white. There's all, in other words, it seems like a very limited way of looking at it.
Yeah, no, it is. And in fact, I say this, and it's not to diminish the book. I mean, I look at the book and I'm happy with it, and it's an accomplishment, but I would much rather watch the 20-minute video on Scott Pilgrim than read the chapter about it, just because I think it is a lot more engaging. And that's what I think is so great about the videographic kind of work, is you can speak to an audience outside of the the ivory tower, outside of academia. Because to get my book, it's, if you bought the hardcover, which I hope you didn't, it was $75 for a while.
Jesus, yeah,
high bar of entry, right? Now I think that the paperback is maybe $20 on sale, but it's like, that's still like, I mean, it's hard to read. It's written for an academic audience. There's certain expectations and how the prose works and how you engage with other literature that way. It's not written for a mass audience, which is why I think it's kind of hilarious that the press gives it to, like, I don't know if you've seen it, but on like NetGalley, it has all these reviews where like people who like comic books like pick up the book and they're like, what the fuck is this thing? It reads like an academic monograph. And I'm like, well, it is. The problem is people expect it to be, written like a Roger Ebert book, and it's not. It's just there's different expectations with tone and voice, and I think videographic work kind of opens that up and makes it accessible, where you can kind of meet both audiences along the way. you can have a complicated idea and present it in a way in which you can get your mom or your grandma or your brother or your sister who may be interested in the topic but not have a BA or a PhD in it, to understand your argument in ways that you can't in a written form.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't know if you would agree with that this is like a videographic essay, but the Martin Scorsese's Journey Through American Movies, or Journey Through Movies, or something like that. That was one of the first things I saw. Like, I was probably shown a VHS copy in film school, honestly, at Santa Barbara, but it was like the first time I'd ever really seen something, because you'd see every once in a while during the Oscars, they'd have these little segments where they'd like tell you, and I always wanted more of that. Like, show me more like excerpts and clips. Like, I mean, part of it is like, film wasn't nearly as accessible to us when we were younger. Like, it was, you had to actually go rent them from Blockbuster or find them somewhere, where it's easier. Like, now I can like literally just get online and look up Un Chien Andalou and like watch the whole thing. And like, that's not something that I even like knew existed back then. But yeah, the Scorsese thing, were you inspired at all by, I mean, I'm wondering when you started doing your video essays, because like, it seems like your Kubrick thing is in part like a response to Room 237, which is a kind of video essay. It's probably one of the most like well-known examples of that genre, almost.
Yeah,
right?
no, it was a deliberate attempt to rebuke Room 237, which I hated at the time, because I think people watched it and it's like, yeah, you know, this is essentially, I've only seen it once, and
me too.
The first time I saw it, I was kind of like, does it agree with these people and think that these readings are reasonable, or does it think these people are ridiculous? And the first time I walked away from it, I was like, no, it kind of buys in on this. And I'm like, as a film scholar, I think most of these readings are just pure horse shit. And there's the one about like the, you know, Native American genocide that I'm like, yeah, that one I can kind of get on board with. That's like a reasonable, like, there's enough in the text that gives me the sense that could be plausible, right? Whereas like the moon landing one, and, you know, let's play the movie backwards. I mean, I get some of that, but like, you know, like, I'm just like, I don't want to put them, I don't want to equate them, right? Which is what I feel like the movie does, is it's like, this form of engagement is the same as the I feel like now I probably see more nuance there. But yeah, I was really frustrated because I think The Shining is a really rich movie in its ambiguities, and it provides a lot of pockets for you to kind of enter in and test things out and play around with ideas. And I was like, man, I want to see like a real version of Room 237. I want to see it straight. I don't want to see the parody or whatever this movie is trying to be. I want to see this. But yeah, I think Room 237, I think the Scorsese docs, I think to go back to someone like Godard's Histoire du Cinema, like those are all kind of precursors to what we're trying to do as videographic critics. But yeah, it's, you know.
And when you say we, there's a magazine that you just put out a new issue, right, that collects these?
Yeah, we have our website, In Transition. It's an online journal, and there used to be a lot more outlets for this kind of work. Roger Ebert, when he was alive, was posting some through Roger Ebert's site. He kind of got connected with Matt Zoller-Seiss, who had overseen Press Play for a while, which did videographic works until that was under IndieWire, and then I think they got their budgets cut, and then Fandor was doing it for a while. But then Fandor, and they had Kevin Lee kind of overseeing their work editorially, and he's really great. But essentially Fandor wanted more like light puff pieces where it's like, here's 100 of Arnold Schwarzenegger's greatest lines, and it's like, that's not the kind of work I do. It wasn't the kind of work most of us wanted to do on the other side of getting paid for it. But like, yeah, all of a sudden everything that was kind of unique about what we were doing, like the analysis, was kind of getting drained out of it. And they were just kind of becoming super cuts. And Fandor kind of moved away from that too. So unfortunately, yes, we have the journal In Transition, and there are a lot of people working on it, but you don't really have the same hubs that you used to, right? So everyone out there kind of doing this now outside of academia is kind of more of like a free agent.
Yeah.
And there's actually a podcast that's devoted to this called the Video Essay Podcast, I think it's called, by Will Gravato, I think he's doing it. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but yeah, it's gaining some traction, but it's constantly, kind of fluctuates with what the marketplace wants and what people want to see. So that's always kind of one of the difficult pieces about this.
Yeah, I've seen that, like, a few different YouTube accounts that do it, and that do them pretty well. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Nerd Writer, that guy. Like, I've used a couple of his every once in a while. He kind of can be kind of room 237-y a little bit, in terms of like making big kind of conclusions from like what this film really means. But it to me, it's like, well, I can use these clips as a kind of conversation starter about a film. But yeah, I wondered, like, if you could comment just really quickly, because I know we're running out of time here. But I didn't stay with film as my discipline, and there wasn't any particular reason why. I just kind of like wanted to major in history and got into American history for a number of reasons after I graduated from UCSB, and I ended up going to do history. But I did the film studies doctoral certificate program while I was there because I couldn't keep myself from taking film classes. I'm like, always, like, my heart is with like film departments and film studies. I love it as a discipline, and like right now I'm teaching Zoom classes on the history of cinema I haven't taught in a long time, and it's just like super exhilarating, and like getting into like that exact thing of like, how do you illustrate this? How do you show it visually while you're introducing these concepts? But I wonder, like, I mean, I know we're in like this quarantine moment and pandemic, so it's like everything's up for grabs, but like, what is the state of like film studies as a discipline? I mean, the humanities in general have been like, everyone's talking about it in such a pessimistic way, and it's in decline. But what's going on in film studies?
I mean, it's a hard question because it's a big question.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's not film studies anymore, which some people get really upset about and other people get, kind of exhilarated and happy about. The best kind of example of this that I can give is that the journal for the Society of Cinema and Media Studies, the biggest kind of scholarly organization in the field for years, was called Cinema Journal. And a couple of years ago, they changed the name to the Journal for Cinema and Media Studies. And some people were really kind of upset about this. It was very kind of split. I think there was far more of an emphasis on people who wanted to change the name, but the old guard was kind of like, no, we started off as cinema studies. Cinema studies is important. And then I would say probably since the 80s, the approach to media studies, to cinema studies or film studies, has been to do media studies, which is like, you look at a department like Santa Barbara, UCLA, and it's like you got a TV person, you got an international film person, you got, a video game person, you got somebody who does new media. And that to me is really kind of the field. And there are certain things that are lost that way. Like I like to talk about blind spots a lot because I think they're kind of fascinating. Like how long was it? In the 10 years I was in school, I never had a class on Marx.
Yeah.
I never had a class devoted to like John Ford, so like there are certain foundational pieces of what used to be considered the film studies 101 that I lost out on, right? I didn't get the golden age auteur class. I got a auteur class on Jean-Luc Godard, which in certain ways is still probably a little more old guard. So certain things kind of fall through the cracks. Like I don't know how many people watch genre noir movies anymore, or I felt like Bergman had a bit of a resurgence because of that Criterion box set, but I feel like there's certain classics that kind of fall through the cracks when all of a sudden you have to remove, maybe an international film class from your core master's program to make room for the history of television. But in other ways, right, that's very much the media landscape we're in.
Yeah.
That's very much kind of what keeps us relevant now, right? So it's not like people, it's not like cinema's getting the audience numbers that it got in the 40s anymore, right? We are dealing with films that are part of multimedia conglomerates that own music, and they own, internet companies, and they own theme parks. So you have to really think about, I think, media studies as being this kind of more holistic, multimedia experience now. So I think that's what you're seeing more in media studies, and that kind of fracturing off and splintering is, not only in terms of objects of study, but methodology as well, like more emphasis on gender and race and, less people working on psychoanalysis that we saw in the 70s. It's just, everyone's kind of got their own like little sandbox, which in some ways can be kind of lonely because you don't often come back and have a conversation with everyone at the same time. But there's ways that it kind of migrates and it leaves room at the table for everyone. I remember when I started working on my dissertation, I got a little side eye because people were like, comic books, they're at the table now.
Yeah.
Like we're going to let comic books sit here.
Right.
Comic book movies, like that's strange. And, I basically said to some folks who kind of saw my project a little pessimistically, I said, remember back in the 70s and 60s and 70s when you had to like advocate for the importance of John Wayne movies to people who were studying Shakespeare?
Yeah.
I'm like, you remember when you were doing that? That's what I'm doing now, and so like I feel like every new wave of the media studies movement kind of has to advocate for their position at the table, but I think everyone's pretty open-minded about it now, and it's just
that makes sense. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but when I think about the conversations that were happening in the film studies department at UC Santa Barbara in the late 90s when I was there, it was all about this kind of like digital is coming and it's going to change everything. And we're all of us theory kids were pissed about CGI ruining everything. And, it seems like that conversation has evolved a lot. But either way, the bigger point is that we're living through a kind of technological media kind of revolution, and it makes sense that the Academy would want to kind of come to terms with that in one way or another. But yeah, at the same time, I have a kind of, and that's maybe my nostalgia trap is like the film studies departments of the 70s, even though I wasn't there for them. But yeah, that kind of like Marxist, John Wayne, that kind of stuff, which is funny because I love that you're pointing out that at one point, even studying that stuff was a fight in the Academy. So it's always a fight.
Yeah, and it's also like, what more could you like? And I mean, I get it. I wish people would watch them and talk about them and think about them. But it's also like, what more can you say about some of that stuff? Like, I remember I took this history of LA class, and it was the first big fight I got in with a professor. And I like this guy. His name was Tom Hines. He's an LA architecture historian. But I was taking a class in the history program, and I was like, I'm going to do a paper on film studies, and I wrote a history of the Directors Guild. And the reason I wrote it is because there aren't a lot of guild histories in cinema studies. They're kind of boring. They're legalistic, but I was like, I'm going to write about something people don't write about.
It's like labor. It's kind of like a form of labor history, right?
Yeah, it's like labor history, right? Yeah. So he gets it, and he's just kind of like, really? This is it? He's like, this is, no offense, this is kind of boring. He was like, I thought you were going to write something about Hitchcock or like Howard Hawks. And I'm like, what else can you say about that? I've got 35 books about him. I can't like stake out a new claim there. I can, play around with him, but it's like everything that's been said about Hitchcock, there's very little you can add to that conversation at this point. So I get the desire in certain ways to kind of move beyond and try to find new terrain. But I do think, especially sometimes when I'm reading film critics today, where I'm like, you got to go back and watch some of that old stuff. You have to go back and read some of that older stuff, right? Especially when we see like conversations about the gays, I'm like, you need to like have an understanding of where this came from and what she's actually talking about, right? I know that you have this kind of sense of what you think that means, but it's not that, so
yeah,
like,
right.
Like you can't like neglect history, but you do need that to follow those breadcrumbs and just kind of know what avenues we can keep going down and which aren't necessarily worth following anymore.
Yeah, I feel we're losing that, and that part of it, to me, I don't think it's necessarily productive to just keep going back to Hawks and Hitchcock and things like that, and it's time to move on. But it kills me when I hear like these newer film critics saying like, oh, I can't watch anything before 1975 because that's when film really got good, is when Jaws and the blockbusters started coming. And I'm like, wait a second, like when I was in school in the 90s, that like. What was it like? Easy Riders, Raging Bulls was like the story of New Hollywood, and the villains were Spielberg and Lucas for bringing this kind of like blockbuster cinema and ruining the art that the 70s filmmakers were gonna make. And I think that we're time for a new narrative there as well. But either way, it's just jarring to hear like the opposite narrative being told, which is that actually cinema was born in the 70s, and the blockbusters are what actually brought cinema to the point where it's a form of art that is valuable to us in a way that the old ones aren't.
But I think that also goes hand in hand with what we expect as a society out of like film critics, and what kind of education do we expect. And even like to think about this from the other side of the equation, right? One of the reasons why film studies is getting so bifurcated and fractured is because of, the need to train people to make those movies that we were kind of deriding at, UCLA or Santa Barbara, where it's like, yep, deans want to see those classes because they want to be able to say to parents, like, we're teaching your kids how to do something useful with that, right?
Right.
So I feel like it's all like part of this, it's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where you kind of just constantly ask at every step, like, what is our goal here? What is our goal as readers of this kind of film criticism? What is our goal as writers of it? Where can we start to kind of challenge the cycle so that we actually produce something that is contributing to a dialogue and trying to just include people in a conversation and enrich that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's difficult to, those kinds of pieces don't read well. They, the nuance and ambiguity and, lukewarm takes don't necessarily engage as well as something like, Steven Spielberg doesn't have an eye for craft.
Right. Yeah. It's clickbait, and that's what that's the landscape we're occupying. Someone will be getting a PhD in clickbait at some point. I'm sure.
I'm sure somebody already has, but I mean that's on us. I mean, that's what we want to read too. So it's like it's kind of one of these things where it's like I can get mad at Noah for tweeting that, but it's like people want to read that.
Yeah.
There's a reason why people are more drawn to Room 237 than they are to my piece on Kubrick, and it's because it's more batshit and weird. People, there's just a certain willingness to engage with certain kinds of things. Like there's a reason Cinema Sins is more, popular and viewed as more kind of, critically enlightened than stuff that the scholarship community or the academic community is doing, because it's, it's just easier.
Yeah.
It's just easier.
No, that makes sense, and that's why
it's easier to produce.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to talk to you, Drew. I thank you, Dr. Drew Morton, for sharing some time with me. Your videographic essays, and there's a bunch of them. I'm still going through them. I think they do a really good job of it may be that Room 237 gets a little more attention, but I think as time goes on, my hope is that there's more interest in those kinds of engagements with film, because it's like, to me, I learned a lot watching your Kubrick piece, and there's a bunch of others on there that I'm going to go through. So I'll point my listeners your way. But thanks so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. It was great to kind of get out of the repetition of the quarantine day. So I appreciate it.
enjoy your Zoom department meetings.
Yeah, we'll do.
All right.
Take care.
You too. All right, huge thank you to Dr. Drew Morton. I had a really great time talking with him. I feel like when it comes to movies, I could talk forever, so I like to kind of try to pick things and frame them. We started off talking about the Coen brothers there, but there's so many more directions we could go. So thank you, Drew, for joining us, and we will be talking to more film people and more film conversations as we try and wrap our minds around this pop cultural moment, because it's a critical element, I think, in decoding the larger kind of story and connecting to some of the big kind of political, economic, Marxist stuff that Justin and others have talked about on the show and bring to the show as well. So I hope you're enjoying our movie Sojourn. If you want to support our show and get more of our analysis and ideas and vibe checks, etc., that's at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks so much for enjoying the show, and we'll talk to you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.